Welcome everybody to another session of the Community of Practice that the American Nuclear Society has been holding for the last couple of years now. The Risk-Informed Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee is part of the Standards Committee in the American Nuclear Society. We call it RP3C. My name is Prasad Kadambi, and I am chair of RP3C. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. Modernization has come to mean that risk-informed and performance-based methods are employed to overcome the difficulties that we all know about with purely deterministic and prescriptive methods. We've been calling these methods RIPB approaches. The Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act specifically addresses RIPB approaches. There's a lot of guidance available on RIPB approaches, but most people have not had reason to become familiar with the guidance because the conventional approaches still dominate most things that we do, including standards development. Right now, ANS, I think, can be considered as a knowledge center for RIPB concepts and methods. RP3C initiated these community of practice webinars on RIPB to enable practitioners of RIPB approaches to share their knowledge and experience. We have scheduled these webinars for the last Friday of each month. Today, we are going to hear from Adam Stein of the Breakthrough Institute. This is the first time that we are having a presenter from a group of non-government organizations who have become much more active recently in RIPB approaches. And I want to invite others who work with non-government organizations to think about speaking about your work, on one of these community of practice sessions. At this point, I'd like to invite Adam Stein to make the presentation today, and he will introduce the Breakthrough Institute to all of you. Thank you very much. Adam, please take it away.
Thank you, Prasad. And thank you for giving me the invitation to come speak today. I'm the Director of Nuclear Energy Innovation at the Breakthrough Institute. The Breakthrough Institute is an independent research center that identifies and promotes technological solutions to environmental and human development challenges. We represent the interests of society, not industry, and we do not receive any funding from industry. Today, I'm going to speak a little bit about the 10 CFR Part 53 rulemaking, in particular, how it relates to performance-based rulemaking. On February 8th, I made a similar presentation to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that invited non-governmental organizations to speak about Part 53 rulemaking. The beginning of these slides are largely from that presentation, but I go into much more greater detail about performance-based metrics later. In general, our comments on the 10 CFR Part 53 rulemaking are that it presents a once-in-a-generation opportunity for regulatory innovation that considers the public interests. It must meet the mandate of the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act to enable that innovation and commercialization. As defined in NEMA, it should be a performance-based rule, which should be easier to be technologically inclusive. And we also encourage the NRC staff, in particular, to be disciplined and apply reasonable assurance of adequate protection consistent with the NRC's mandate, instead of going beyond that mandate. What does reasonable assurance of adequate protection mean? Well, the NRC's qualitative safety goals specify that it bears no significant additional risk to life and health. And to society, it bears no significant impact to life and health to society either, but it also should be comparable to or less than the risks of generating electricity by viable competing technologies. This comparison is not currently done with NRC regulation. Efficiency in this rulemaking is also imperative. There's already been a 9-month extension of the rulemaking timeline, yet there's still major policy issues that have not been evaluated by the Commission. We encourage that the NRC staff should have done that or will do that soon. Now, the ACRS committee also recommended to the NRC staff to do the same thing, push major policy issues to the Commission to get feedback now instead of later in the process. NRC staff's taken an iterative process that is not very straightforward, but it has allowed much more stakeholder interaction early on, which is in part why many NGOs like the Breakthrough Institute have been able to be more involved. Yet the staff has not dispositioned feedback or even responded to basic comments at times in meetings, something that they are very willing to do to the ACRS committee, but not to other stakeholders. So what is the current status of Part 53? Well, it initially focused on codifying the licensing modernization project that was developed for Part 50 and 52. It was risk-informed, but not necessarily performance-based. The LMP type focused on probability, PRA in what they called a leading role. Later, they added, due to stakeholder feedback, Part 5X. 5X was a deterministic option that enabled the use of international standards, as seen below in a clip I took from one of the NRC slides from the last August meeting. Since then, just this month, they refocused into 3 frameworks. 3 frameworks include an enhanced use of PRA, which used to be in a leading role, which is similar to LMP, a traditional use of PRA, which was formerly known as the Part 5X rule, and an alternative approach to PRA, which is essentially the maximum hypothetical accident pathway. It remains uncertain or unclear why these multiple pathways are even needed in the regulation itself, instead of just making approved pathways and guidance, very similar to how LMP is guidance, not a revision to the regulation itself. There are other specific structural concerns of Part 53, including ALERA in the design stage as opposed to ALERA post-design stage, duplication of programmatic controls in many different subparts of Part 53, and how beyond design basis events are included or addressed in the part. It is, more importantly to this group, still not performance-based in many ways. It's not built around clear performance metrics. And it uses some metrics that are not viable as performance metrics, such as the quantitative health objectives. You'll notice here that in the most recent 3 pathways that come from just this month's Advanced Reactor Stakeholder Meeting slides, that the QHOs are in all 3 of those pathways. The QHOs are an example of a major policy issue that has received extensive stakeholder feedback but has not been pushed to the Commission for clear guidance. In the past, the Commission has repeatedly stated that safety goals are guidance on acceptable societal risk and should be used to provide guidance to the NRC staff on how new regulations should be considered. They are not in the current licensing regulations directly. The purpose of including the QHOs in the rule has not been made clear. It is my contention that the QHOs should not be in the rule as they are not a viable performance metric. The question then becomes, why are they not a viable performance metric? Well, there are clear guidelines that have been developed by the NRC to define what a performance-based regulation should look like. NEMA, as I previously stated, directed the NRC to develop a technology-inclusive, risk-informed, performance-based pathway. So keeping in mind that performance-based metrics should be used is paramount. I'm not going to read through all the guidelines of how to assess whether a performance metric is viable or not, but they're included here on the slide for later reference. It is important to note that a viable performance metric must be measurable or calculable parameter to monitor acceptable plant or licensee performance that exists or can be developed. So the question becomes then, can the QHOs be calculated? Health outcomes can be estimated using a multitude of consequence models. However, these projected consequences are not direct calculations or conclusions and contain significant uncertainty. This uncertainty can be addressed in multiple ways, but cannot be eliminated to the point of determining if a level of performance is achieved or not. The multiple consequence projection models that do exist provide different results. They are not exactly the same because we're not calculating a specific outcome. The NRC specifically uses the linear note threshold model to estimate health outcomes, not calculate. The NRC recently confirmed the use of the LNT model by denying a petition of rulemaking to use other models. In that decision, the NRC and other agencies stated very clearly that the LNT remains uncertain. It is not a direct calculation of risk or effects. Here I provide some specific quotes of that uncertainty. The NRC itself says, based on current state of science, the NRC concludes that the actual level of risk associated with low doses of radiation remains uncertain. The IAEA, National Council of Radiation Protection Measurements, have similar statements. Even the Part 20 final rule that was promulgated in the 90s also states something very similar. I'll let you read them later on if you wish. The point being that health effects from low doses are not directly calculable. There's also significant uncertainty in observations. Background latent cancer rates are not consistent geographically, as you can see here. They're not static values. They all have a downward trend over time. And most are 20% below the assumed rate. The assumed rate for each, for the NRC is the dashed line that you see on each state's graphic. This provides a changing and non-uniform basis for regulation. And the assumed background rate that is the currently regulatory standard is inconsistent with observations. This chart provides similar data over the most recent period of 2014 to 2018. This is the most recent period that we have data for. It's age adjusted, cancer deaths from all cancer types, which is the basis provided in the safety goals. The NRC assumed cancer rate of 2 latent cancer fatalities per 1,000 people is depicted on the far right, the QHO assumed rate. The orange dots near the center of each confidence interval are recalculating the QHOs if it was based for each state level, so trying to geographically scale it as 1/10 of 1%, as stated in the qualitative safety goals in the NRC policy statement. As you can see here, that that restated or recalculated safety goal, even if we make them geographically consistent, is well within the error bars of a 95% confidence interval. 95% confidence interval in this case is about 4 deaths per 100,000 people. So even if we readjust geographically for latent cancer mortalities and had state level assumed rates, the QHOs are in the statistical noise. Why is that important? Well, to have an observable value, you need to have a value that is of adequate statistical power. Statistical power is a fundamental issue regarding the estimation of risk for all low dose studies that are statistical in nature. It's a fundamental consideration of all statistical studies, period, not just epidemiological studies for low dose radiation. Statistical power is a probability that a study of a specified size and design can detect a predetermined difference in risk in the absence of significant bias when such a difference exists. If the power is too low, the study is unlikely to find a difference of interest even when it exists. That's a false negative. So even if there is a change in latent cancer in the population, a study with too low of power would not actually observe that change. Any statistically significant, this is usually considered a p-value in statistics, result is likely to be a false positive finding when there's too low of statistical value. So you observe in the data a change in latent cancers, for instance, but that's a false positive. It does not actually occur in the population. Having enough statistical power in a population requires a very large sample size for a very small effect. To attain such a sample size, it would take many years of study because you would have to obtain a sample of enough cancers of that type to compare to see if there was a change in it. As you can see in this chart, the mean whole body dose in millisieverts, we would be well over 10 million people if we were looking at the acceptable level of background emissions from a normal power plant operation. That size of population is much, much larger than the full size of the population around a normal nuclear power plant in the emergency planning zone. But this is even more difficult because we need a sample size of latent cancers that is that large, not the whole population. There's also a consideration of time. There's substantial time between a low dose and the potential for actual cancers to emerge in certain types of cancers. So you could have many decades before effects could be observed at all, even if you had a large enough population. This delayed response makes it essentially impossible to use the QHOs for regulatory oversight in real time. Due to the limited population within the vicinity of the site, it's likely to take many years to reach a statistically valid sample size. For the example in the white paper that I linked to earlier, which is a little bit too lengthy to throw on a slide here, to determine an increased rate in leukemia, which is a cancer type that is highly susceptible to radiation dose, from a high dose of radiation, not a background dose of radiation. Sample size would take 31 years of data inside a 30-mile radius, which is, as we know, much larger than the 10-mile radius around most nuclear power plants operating today. We also consider that most advanced reactors are considering a much smaller emergency planning zone that they would base their safety case off of. It would become even less tenable to actually ever accumulate a sample size of sufficient number of cases. If a sufficient sample size is required by the NRC regulatory guidance before licensing and siting, that would drastically extend the licensing timeline, possibly by decades, to even have a baseline of cancer rate, of true cancer rate around that particular site. So in summary, quantitative health objectives are not a calculable or observable in a meaningful timeline, and therefore they are not a viable performance metric. And I must admit, I went through these slides much faster than I thought I would. But I would love to take any questions at this time.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And I think we have a question on the chat. Let's see. Steve Nesbitt asks, your observation on statistical power seems to be convolving concerns about studies with concerns about calculations. We all hope that we would never need to perform a study of real accident effects on a population around the site.
Well, several studies have been done on real populations around sites. The NRC commissioned the national academies to perform such a study in 2005. And after several years of doing so, the National Academy said that they would not be able to provide data of statistical power to even estimate the potential effects of cancer around a nuclear power plant. So they subsequently canceled the pilot of that study. But the National Academy provided a lot of data and published 2 reports on that effort. So the NRC has tried to perform such a study, and that study provides a basis for the observation that this could not be done in real time to estimate latent cancer fatalities, or the QHOs, in an observation because statistical power is too low. And that also supports this statement that it would never be able to be done in real time for use as regulatory oversight.
Well, Adam, I think, I agree with your point that, and I'm familiar with the National Academy work that basically concluded that the actual impact of normal operation of a nuclear power plant on the surrounding population, that the impacts are to public health and safety are so low that you can't distinguish it from background. It's not practical. I agree with you 100%. But I think that the application of the QHOs would be from a calculational perspective of severe accident risk, not normal operation risk. And in that instance, I don't think that the objections you're raising to the ability to discern impacts at low doses really carries over. I think that these calculations are done all the time in level 3 PRAs. So we know that we can do the calculations. You can argue about whether they're overestimating the health impacts because of uncertainty around linear non-threshold. But I think we all agree that there are health effects, and some of these doses are outside of the low dose range as well. So I guess I'm still not convinced that the inability to discern effects in a population from normal operation means that you can't apply a QHO yardstick when looking at the larger doses to more people that would result from a postulated accident.
So this is not in Part 53 just for postulated accident, but also for standard operation. So it's trying to use the QHO specifically for both this accident scenario and standard operations. And you cannot use them as a performance metric for standard operations. However, even with the postulated accidents, that as a PRA, you are doing a probabilistic projection of risk. I'm sure you would agree, which is not actually a observation of performance to a standard. So it is a risk-based, not a performance-based approach.
It is a calculation of risk. I agree with that. If the point is that it's not a performance-based approach from a standpoint of being based on actual observations, then I agree with you 100%. I don't think that it logically follows that just because it's a calculated value and not an observed value, that it's not potentially useful in regulatory space.
I'm not contending that it's not potentially useful. It is definitely useful for risk informing the process. But to make it the actual yardstick, the performance metric that's in the regulation that needs to be met, that is a different criteria. So Part 53 should be risk informed, but being performance based means you need a performance metric that is either directly calculable or directly observable as the yardstick, the final yardstick.
Well, so any reactor, you can postulate that you're going to have an accident that results in large releases of radioactivity to the population around the plant. Hopefully the probability of that accident that results in some appreciable releases is low enough so that the risk is low. But you can postulate an accident. But you can't measure that. I mean, unless you have the accident, you can't measure it. So does that mean you can't put any criteria in place for those accidents that are very low probability that will never be measured?
That is the basis for the different mindset between a risk-informed performance-based and a risk-based approach. You absolutely should consider risk information, but the performance metric that the NRC would actually require you to do day to day or year to year to make sure that you meet those risk-informed requirements needs to be a different kind of metric, a performance metric. So it's not that the risk information is not usable. It's very usable and very valuable. It is that the way that they regulate to make sure you meet that needs to be a metric that they can observe in real life.
Okay, let's see. There's one more question in the chat. Steve, unless you wanted to say something in response to that?
No, I'll give somebody else a turn. Okay. I appreciate the dialogue, though.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, for that. Franklin Hope has posed the question. I think most people understand that the challenge of translating dose release to health problems is tricky. Could you explain how a less conservative treatment would provide a material benefit in the licensing process?
I would like to know, I suppose, what you mean by less conservative.
Let's see, Mr. Hope, you're welcome to unmute and, discuss the question.
Yeah. I mean, I get what you're saying. You don't like the QHOs, but what are we going to do instead? And how is that going to help, get more nuclear power in society?
So I think I'm glad I asked for clarification, because that's different than what I thought you were asking. So what are we going to do instead is the big question. Others disagree with me, but I see the answer as being rather simple. You just use the already existing dose limits in Part 20, and the dose limits are measurable and calculable based on physics. So they're not just projections of something that we can't observe later on. And so the dose limits would be one option to use as a performance metric. The question that the NRC staff has had previously is, well, what do you do about the very long tail, either very low doses or very, very high doses? Because the Part 20 dose limits are very specific, and they're step functions, either 5 rem or 25 rem, depending on which event class you're looking at. But that's definitely somewhere to start, because it eliminates the unobservable effects of the QHOs, and not necessarily pushing out to the very, very long tails of very improbable events with very low probability events, I should say it that way, makes licensing a little bit simpler, because as we have seen in the last several licensing applications, the NRC staff very often says, well, how do you know that there isn't an event that is beyond where you screened your events to that could be more severe and therefore should be included, even when the applicant is using a screening system that the NRC previously approved for event classification screening. So eliminating these long tails makes licensing simpler, even if we added an additional, say, larger dose limit for very unlikely events. It still is something that we could observe and measure.
Adam, I just want to mention that, as within RP3C, we have people from the NRC, and at least at one time I saw that Bill Reckley was in the audience. And I'd like to ask Bill, are you there? If not, if so, could you unmute and just address the topics? You don't have to give, staff positions or anything, but just, I'd invite whatever you have to say on these topics.
I am here, Prasad. I guess I would just as soon not weigh in on something that that we're actively working on. I will make one correction. The QHOs within the 53 language we've released thus far is only for unplanned events. So the normal operations were not included in that. But beyond that, I'll just let that go.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I just wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity. I don't see any, there's Bob Youngblood has a question. Since evacuation is sometimes an option, but may need to be in place for years, as at Fukushima, do you regard those as a complete approach to specifying the consequences that need to be prevented?
Well, the dose is inherently the consequence that leads to the second order consequence, which is potential cancers. Unless you are also speaking to impacts from the actual evacuation and displacement and other mental health issues that were experienced outside of Fukushima. If you're referring to that, then I mean, you could just type in the chat box yes, or.
I mean, Bob can respond. Bob, please unmute and go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, partly as a result of Fukushima, and then in some people's cases, even before that, there's interest in simply, after Fukushima, some people pointed to the need for evacuation and that it was going to be a long time. And some people's reaction to that was, hey, no dose, no foul. But the need for them to be evacuated, and some, I guess now some of them are being allowed to return, but it's been a long time. It's a consequence worth not suffering. And some European countries actually have analogs to the QHOs that work to try to preclude releases that would warrant that kind of evacuation. So it's a kind of a policy choice whether you want to see that done. I mean, our safety goals are dose-centric, and then you can meet them by evacuation, which seems, I don't know, as I say, it's a policy choice, but to some people, looks like a bad one.
Well,
Hey,
go on.
Yeah, you're on, Adam.
I would not disagree with you that evacuations are have other effects other than dose, definitely. In fact, I've done several studies that try to quantify or provide a framework for when evacuation should be used for sheltering versus other alternative protective actions, because evacuations have been shown to have very large impacts at times. That being said, in terms of Part 53, that has not come up as a consideration to directly put in the regulatory basis, unless, and maybe this is something that Bill Reckley would be willing to actually correct me on if I'm wrong. That's not actually in Part 53 right now as something that is considered directly.
That's true. It's not built in. And out of Fukushima, Bob, what the commission ultimately decided was that we would continue to consider the costs such as evacuations, land contamination, longer term cleanup and such. We consider that when we assess the costs of regulations and regulatory actions. But as you may recall, the commission specifically decided not to expand the safety goals to include the economic factors.
Well, I guess I'm aware that they're part of regulatory analysis, but I think in the safety goal-based screening criteria that sort of come before regulatory analysis, it's all it's all about large early release as opposed to large release. And so, you know, I'll certainly take your word for whatever the commission is up to. I guess my question was triggered by the by Adam's stress on dose and measurability and so forth. It just seemed to me that it seems to some of us that long-term evacuation ought to be on the radar, as I believe it is in Europe, for example.
So I will say that my focus on dose here is because that is in the proposed Part 53 rule language, whereas, say, evacuation is not. And so I'm addressing what is there. Also, the regulatory basis in the United States leaves a lot of the decision making when there is an accident up to the local governments or state governments, and therefore it is their choice how to respond to an incident that has potentially very large impacts on the performance, not the licensee, which the NRC does regulate. So striking that balance between the offsite response organizations and the licensee has been developed through several regulatory guidance documents, specifically New Reg 0654 over many years, and it was recently revised. But since the action doesn't respond with the licensee, it would be a little difficult for the NRC to regulate it directly.
Let's see. Adam, I'd like to pose a question, and I'd like to go back to an earlier point you made about being performance-based. And the fact is that the Commission has provided direction on what a performance-based approach looks like from the direction setting standpoint. And what the Commission has offered are that, you know, you have to look at the result of the regulation or the outcome to see whether those characteristics that it incorporated into the definition of a performance-based regulation will be found in the result of the regulation itself. And that is where, at least in my view, the centrality of having something that is observable, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, and can be made part of a monitoring process and therefore part of the oversight, you know, becomes a key part of being risk-informed and performance-based. Now, I got into my lecture, but I'd like to hear your perspective on it. So,
I mean, you basically summarized it well. That to move to a performance-based approach, you need to be able to. Well, it'd be difficult for me to say much more than what you just said, actually, without just repeating you. So I put back up the guidelines here for assessment because that is important in how the NRC assesses whether a regulation that exists could move to a performance-based regulation. Of course, NEMA directed from the start that this should be a performance-based regulation. So it's a little different than moving an existing regulation to being performance-based. But the idea is that to do so, you need to be able to observe that it is actually functioning as intended. Do you have something more that I could actually answer that you haven't already covered very well?
well, no, thank you. This is your talk. I would invite people to see several presentations on the performance-based approach among the community of practice sessions at the RP3C website. I have myself covered it in a couple of presentations, but I want to give you all the opportunity to ask your questions and clarifications. Let's see, I don't see any other questions on the chat, and there's nothing at all wrong with, ending earlier than an hour. And so I really want to take the opportunity to thank Adam Stein for, making the presentation he did. And, I invite others to maybe come forward and volunteer to make your own presentation with your perspective on any of these topics. So again, thank you all.
Hey, Prasad, can I ask another question?
Yeah, sure. We have time. Yeah,
I just want to follow up on what Adam just said there. And I get that, from your perspective, that QHOs aren't performance-based because they can't be directly measured, but NEMA was risk-informed and performance-based. And there's other things in regulations that can't be directly measured because you hope they don't happen. So so my question, I guess, is the fact that it doesn't meet your standards for performance-based, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's inappropriate for a regulation, from my perspective anyway. And I just want to get your reaction to that.
I agree with that. I do not agree that it should be in a performance-based specifically rule, but I do think that projecting cancers with various methods and using potentially the QHOs as the yardstick is useful for risk informing a rule. I don't disagree with using them in LMP, for instance, but LMP is not specifically trying to go from the ground up to provide a performance-based specifically rule. It is a method to, say, provide a new pathway through an existing rule that was originally risk-based. So I don't disagree that this is useful in regulation. It just doesn't fit in this particular regulation.
But you keep saying because it's not performance-based, but the regulation doesn't have to be just performance-based. It's supposed to be risk-informed performance-based. That's what NEMA says. It doesn't just say performance-based. That's where I'm getting hung up on this, the perspective that if it's not performance-based, it can't be in Part 53.
So my reading of that is that risk information should be used to guide what programmatic controls, what other performance metrics are used to make sure that standard or safety is met, and that specifically being risk informed means that you are focusing on the most important or highest risk events or potential cliff edge events are being addressed. But the actual yardstick, the thing that the regulation measures against or requires to be done, is a performance metric, not a risk metric. And I believe that the NRC's documentation on what is a performance-based rule, such as the brochure that's at the bottom of this particular slide, and other SECIs and SRMs that I can provide or have provided in my white paper, support that reading of what a performance-based rule actually uses as the yardstick, as the metric that licensees are held to.
I guess we'll have to agree to disagree on the question of whether Part 53 should be exclusively performance-based or should allow for some element of risk measurement and calculable answers rather than just measurable answers.
Okay. I would love to discuss this more in person sometime.
Sounds good.
Yeah, that was great. Adam, I want to thank you for taking note of that document, New Reg
Prasad?
ER 0303. So,
Prasad,
yeah,
this is George. Let me go back historically on the safety goals in general, because we're talking about quantitative safety goals. But if you look at back what the commission did, and I helped set the safety goals for the commission as part of a team that looked at economists, sociologists, and psychologists to help the commission understand how the public would receive this. But the original health safety goals that were published in the policy statement were intended to indicate that nuclear power plants were of low risk. That's why with the numbers that are in there are 1/10 of 1% of the health effects from cancer and 1/10 of 1% of mortality rates came about because they felt that that was sufficiently low. If you met those objectives and you didn't carry this out to the tails of the curve, that it would show that nuclear power was consistent with other energy sources and probably safer than most. So you have to kind of go back a little bit because the quantitative health objectives came from the staff. It didn't really come from the commission explicitly because they did not want to put that into the regulations. They wanted to keep it as a policy statement. And people are asked to compare what their plant risk is to the quantitative health objectives. But in earlier days, the commission refused to put that into the regulations. And I think that's what Adam is trying to get across. It shouldn't be a part of a regulation or rulemaking. It can be a guide on how to determine whether your plant is as safe as other plants. But the commission at that time, and this was in a meeting at Harper's Ferry just before they released the numbers, decided to go from a quantitative number, which was that HRS numbers that they wanted to put in as quantitative health objectives, to a qualitative health. And that's all they really have issued. Everything else is coming from the staff. It's my understanding there really is no policy that guides what are the quantitative health objectives. So I'm just saying that you kind of have to go back to the history, and I was involved in that 2 or 3 day meeting with the commission, and they changed their mind from a quantitative number to purely qualitative values. And so just remind, I agree with Adam, at the time they were formulated, and then when the quantitative health objectives were formulated, they were not expected to be part of the rule. And therefore you're held to them. So just a background of information.
George, just to clarify something, the quantitative health objectives are part of the commission's safety goal policy statement. The commission also said that they did not, we're not going to put those into the regulations in 1986 for light water reactors. But it wasn't like the staff added the QHOs on after the commission came up with the safety goals. It's all part and parcel. I went back and read them today. I mean,
well, I'll let Adam respond. There's a question on the chat. I just want to get to it quickly if we can.
So it says, it asks what performance-based method would I use to, or propose for to be in Part 53 for preventing severe accidents. Severe accidents typically involve multiple failures. I definitely agree that severe accidents typically involve multiple failures. A PRA chain for a severe accident is usually many failures. Let me give an example. And the NRC has kind of already taken on this approach in many ways. So programmatic controls are operational observations. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this. And there are several programmatic controls built into the Part 53 rule language already. And this might address a little bit of what Steve Nesbitt was talking about also. So if the design is analyzed to be risk informed to meet the safety objectives, the safety goals, the performance metric is not measuring whether they are meeting that safety goal, because at least as I say here, that's not really possible in reality. But what you can do is have a programmatic control in place to observe in real time that the various safeguards or barriers or layers of defense and depth that were required in the design to meet that level of safety are operating properly. And that would be something that you could determine whether the staff of the plant is doing correctly to perform to that safety standard.
Thank you, Adam. I think you answered the question, and we are at the hour mark, and I do try to keep it to an hour. I want to again thank you for not only making the presentation, but very effectively answering some very difficult questions. And this will be something of value as a recorded session on the ANS website. So everybody, thank you for participating, and please stay safe and come back next month. Thank you all. Bye.